I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, but moving to the presentation itself, compared to the previous presentations, I have a rather lightweight, maybe unpleasant, but I'm talking about a completely different scale of the problem, because I decided, together with the co-authors, Ms. Okraszewska and Mr. Richter, who are listening to us, I wanted to present a problem which is often neglected, namely the interaction between the cyclists and the pedestrians. As we know, cycling traffic has been growing significantly, and the presentation does not cover this year's results and the situation when the pandemic created a certain impact on the development of the cycling paths, but we see a significant increase in bicycling traffic. But there are some new problems which either have existed before, but they are much more visible and acute now. So accidents, collisions, or even incidents occurring between cyclists and pedestrians. The problem that we're touching results from the fact that both the pedestrians and the cyclists are unprotected participants. Pedestrians are less protected or more unprotected. So in any incidents between a cyclist and a pedestrian, it is the pedestrian who usually is more vulnerable. There are obviously victims on the part of the cyclists, but typically pedestrian is more vulnerable. If you just look at the database of accidents, the number of collisions between pedestrians and cyclists is on the rise, and generally the guilty party is most often the cyclist and the victim is most often the pedestrian, but not always. Why is the problem so important? Safety is one thing, but the second thing is the feeling of being safe, especially in those areas in which the pedestrian would like to feel comfortably. The pavement is designed for pedestrian traffic, so the main function is for moving. But let's remember that the sidewalk, the pavement is often used for window shopping, is used for safe movement of children, also for dog walking. So the issues related with a certain discomfort, perceived discomfort, are so very important. We chose 6 largest cities for analysis. Why? Because these have faced the most significant transport problems usually related to congestion. It is in those cities that it would be worth to change transport habits and behaviors. And it so happens that altogether these cities are inhabited by about 5 million people. The database has been taken from the CEVIC system that we've been using since the very beginning, from 2007. We've included data up until 2018. We didn't do to 2019. We were able to take into account pretty much all road accidents. We could have treated them individually. We focused on the relation between the culprits and the victims. But in addition to the classic approach, where we measure what happened when, I wanted to point out especially at the analysis where we wanted to indicate certain changes that occurred over the years. We should also finish with forecasts, but it often happened while we were working that COVID turned our work upside down. Certain things started happening faster, so it's quite difficult at the moment to build a reliable forecast of the number of incidents for the coming years because the rules have changed completely. Now, what sort of scale are we talking about? During those years, since 2007, there were not so many incidents in those 6 cities. A month most of the incidents involve a single cyclist and a single pedestrians. We have also some accidents where there are some additional vehicles. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on these groups of accidents in which there are very, very few fatalities. There were 4 fatalities, but this is very little compared to what my predecessors were indicating for road traffic. What is worrying is the very high number of seriously injured victims, which means that even a cycling accident can be serious. Now, it would seem that the size of the city would not impact the situation, but not really so. You can see that Warsaw has the highest figures, but you can see that the other cities, there's no rule. All these cities are above 450,000, but there's a very big but there are not big differences between them. We can generally say that incidents were on the rise. How many guilty cyclists, how many guilty pedestrians? Guilt of pedestrian is green, guilt of cyclists is red. We have some incidents where no guilty was found. But really, there was probably someone who took a note, made a report from the incidents. Sometimes they were subjective. Sometimes it was decided that the guilt was on both parts. The blue line makes us happy, saying that not always were there victims. We see that on the right-hand side, on the victims graph, that there are far more pedestrians who suffered in the accident. Both lines, despite their differences, are on the rise. What is interesting here is another graph. Where are the perpetrators, the guilty parties, on the side of both cyclists and pedestrians? You can say that generally the cyclist perpetrators come from a very narrow group, 25 to 30 to 45 years. In case of pedestrians, the guilty parties are more evenly spread. If we look at victims, we have a similar situations. On the side of cyclists, the number of victims also is dominated by the younger age groups. Generally speaking, you could say that we have a 10-year shift between cyclists and pedestrians in terms of victims. The perpetrators and the victims are younger, cyclists. Now, what was the share? Let's just look at specifically those incidents where the reports mentioned the guilty party, the perpetrator. We can see that there is an increased number of pedestrian perpetrators, but you could also say that if we look at perpetrators, this is dominated by red, so basically pedestrians are usually the guilty party. If we look at victims, now this is very green, and green is for pedestrian. Most of the victims are green, although as of 2011 the share of victim cyclists is on the rise. We could say, therefore, that the pedestrians are not completely undefensive based on this. Now, what is the share of serious injury? We're talking about people who are severely injured. There are a few, very few, but there are some fatalities. We can say that in recent years, the lines, these are the dotted lines, are going a little up. We'll see what happens in these years, in the time of COVID, where the rules stopped, changed completely. Now, given the differences in infrastructure, what are they? We're talking about sidewalks. There are rather few perpetrators if the infrastructure is dedicated to pedestrian. We're talking sidewalks. Now, if we look at infrastructure that's dedicated to cyclists, then here in most cases the perpetrators were the pedestrians. The certain share on the part of the cyclists results from situations where there was a pedestrian crossing across the bicycle path and the cyclist did not give way. Now we have victims, and in terms of infrastructure, most victims on pavements, on sidewalks, most victims were pedestrians. If we look at infrastructure dedicated to cyclists, so bicycle paths, we see that there are some areas where victims are even predominantly cyclists. If you look at other infrastructure, we can say that in terms of guilt, in recent years especially, it seems 50-50. In victims, still there are more pedestrians. Interesting thing about traffic lights. Where we have traffic lights, clearly there is more guilt on the part of the cyclists. Similarly, in case of situations where there are no traffic lights, there is a shift. There is even more guilt on the part of the cyclists. You can find all this data in the presentation. Let me just conclude so I make it within the time. We have to be prepared for the increasing number of those incidents. We need to think of how we can reduce them. Perhaps we should redefine some principles of designing the space so that the space can be more friendly for both groups of users. So when we are using traffic, we should feel safe. There's no business in it for us to observe increased cycling traffic at the cost of reduced pedestrian traffic. We should absolutely increase the number of cyclists, but at the cost of reducing journeys made by car. So hopefully we will be in that way go towards the better type of mobility. Thank you for your attention. Once again, apologies for the technical difficulties. Thank you.